Okay. Hi, I am here today talking with Ryan Morales Green. He is a New York City based actor, singer, producer, and founder of Latine Musical Theater Lab, an organization committed to developing and producing new Latine written works of musical theater. He's performed in the national tour of Flashdance the Musical and has numerous other New York City and regional theater credits. So, with that, I would like to begin asking you to share a little more about yourself and how you got started in musical theater.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. So I'm one of those kids that like did a lot of theater growing up, like elementary school, middle school, high school. But I never really thought it was going to be a career. I was always good at math. I thought I'd be like an aerospace engineer or something like that. So you can imagine the shock and awe my parents experienced when my junior year of high school, I made my first trip to New York City. And I was like, I love this. I want to be here. I want to do this. And they were like, excuse me? Uh, what? And thankfully, they were eventually really supportive. But the deal I made with him was I was like, well, I don't want to go into this if it's just like a pipe dream, if it's not something that I actually have enough skill or talent at or whatever. And so I made a deal. I was like, okay, I'm going to only apply to schools that you have to audition to get into. And so I auditioned for five schools. I got into one. I ended up going to Shenandoah Conservatory, and it was a cool experience. And I learned a lot there. And then I went to New York and had so much more to learn. Which is I think the case for a lot of folks. The college is the first part, and then we go on to New York and learning in the real world. But that's how I got into it, and I did the nice like conservatory, really intensive musical theater program for 4 years, and actually stuck with it and continued on to being a professional actor.
I love that. That's amazing. Let's see here. So, what has your career been like? Are like some of the biggest challenges you've faced? Did you? Well, I'll launch into that later. But yeah, just kind of an overview of your career since college and what that's kind of been like.
Yeah, I'm grateful for the challenges because there have been highs and lows of it. When I first graduated from school, I still had a lot to learn, like as a human being, as a person, in terms of like my skill and training. I would say one of my biggest regrets is that I left college and didn't immediately just find a voice teacher in New York and continue that training. Part of me felt like I graduated, I'm a senior, I'm a professional, I know how to sing. I don't need to continue my training and continue my learning and growing. And so I didn't really pursue a lot of learning opportunities right out of school. And I spent, I've been in New York almost 9 years now, and uh, for the first bit was getting auditions, not really getting callbacks in the non-union theater world, and then I started getting a little more callbacks, and especially as I started training again and going back to a voice teacher and going back to acting classes. Okay, cool, getting more and more, and then I got to a point where I hit like a nice high. I got that lead role in Flashdance. Um, and was working pretty consistently like for a while, non-union the first 4 or 5 years of my career. Got to a point where I was out of town for about half the year at a time working, which was great. And then I got my equity card working at Disney World in at the end of 2016, 2017. And then the cycle happened again. So I got my union card. I got a job, gratefully, that first audition season. And then it was, another like year or two leading up to COVID of trying to get my footing again. There was a part of it like after my first job at Equity, I actually changed my name to Ryan Morales instead of Ryan Neil Green. Morales is my mom's maiden name, because I wanted to be seen more authentically for who I was instead of people playing this guessing game. I'm like ethnically ambiguous, which isn't a term we use anymore. But so it had people being like, oh, well, maybe you could be in this show. Maybe you could do that. Maybe you could do this. And I was like, nah, nah. I want to be, I'm Puerto Rican and Italian, and I want to be called in for the things that meet like my actual, upbringing and my background and whatnot. So um, it's been like kind of like this, like you go up, it goes down. You go up, especially getting into the equity world. But it's been nice because I feel like the challenges have challenged me to like actually go out and figure out, okay, what do I need to learn? What do I need to know? And I really do think that the time you put in pays dividends as long as you're approaching it from that like growth mindset. Like the more people see you, the more they will trust you and maybe bring you in for this. And maybe they really like your work even if you don't get the job. You get to there really is progression that's available if you put the time in. It has at least been my experience.
That is great. So we're gonna launch more into the Latine side of things because that is what this is
Yeah.
for. Even though I would love to talk more about just career in general. Um, so I want to know a little more about Latina Musical Theater Lab, how it started, what inspired you to start it, and maybe like where you want to see it grow. Um, yeah.
Great. Well, I alluded a little bit to where like maybe some of the frustration comes from me of being a Latina, a Latino musical theater artist. Like when I changed my name and I was a pretty new equity member, I basically didn't audition for much of anything besides Evita for a year. It was really difficult to get appointments. If someone wasn't specifically looking for someone Latino, someone Latine, but I wasn't really getting in the room much, and I was hitting the pavement, going to EPAs, going to ECCs, and doing everything I could to kind of get up in my career. And this is coming from like a white passing Latino male. You know what I mean? It's even harder for women, for people who are non-binary, for people who are Afro-Latine. And so part of that just comes from the fact that like if you look at our canon, it's so small. It's West Side Story, it's In the Heights, and it's Evita, and they're all pretty specific shows. If for the Sharks, you got to dance. There's not really much acting or singing or character development in that show. If you're a guy, you know, so that can be a really hard thing to get into if that's not your skill set. In the Heights is also pretty specific. The hip hop, the rapping, again, the dance. So it can be really difficult if you don't have certain skill sets to work as a Latina actor. And then even when you are, you're kind of doing the same thing over and over and over again. It's like Groundhog Day. Um, and so there's not a lot of Latina musicals being brought to really any stage of the game, and especially ones written by actual Latina writers. Um, and so, I was looking at the stats the other day for Latina writers on Broadway in the 2018-2019 season. There were zero. This includes plays. Wasn't a single person. And that's pretty standard for a population in New York City. It's like 27% of the population, and we're not getting roles on Broadway. We're not getting cast on Broadway. We're not getting stories on Broadway. And this is very common across every every sort of bucket, if you want to call it that way, in BIPOC experience. It's the same thing with Manasa people. It's the same thing for the AAPI folks. Black folks have it, I guess, better, but there's a lot of problems with a lot of the material that Black folks are asked to perform on Broadway and what is attractive to a white audience. So, the Latina Musical Theater Lab has come up from the fact that I could create an organization that specifically serves all BIPOC folks, but there's actually something really powerful, I think, in specificity. There's something really powerful in being able to serve like a smaller group and a smaller community that's still large enough and it still is encompassing a lot of different backgrounds. But it's got something that really ties us together. And so that's a bit of like the why. But for me, I've started over COVID producing a lot more, and getting really interested in that piece of it. I've always had a desire to want to change what kind of shows really get to Broadway because I find a lot of stuff that gets there is a little overly produced or underproduced. There's a big adherence to like the movie musical formula. Something taking a movie and going, oh, this would make a good musical, and that's really hit or miss. And so, as a lover of Broadway, I've been disappointed over the years, over 9 years of being in New York, of how few things really land and how difficult it is. And then, so for me, I've always wanted a chance to be able to help that. And so the stars kind of aligned that my producing brain was going, well, what am I producing? What am I creating? What am I bringing into the world? And I've had this big desire to make a change for myself and my fellow Latina performers. And I've got a really big desire to help improve the landscape of what lands on Broadway. So I was doing a personal project. I just wanted to reach out and meet more Latina, composers and writers because I just was like, I never get to do even shows written by, fellow Latina people. I want to meet some of the people that are doing it and just get to know them. And in talking to several folks, I started to understand just how big that gap is and just how big the gap of opportunity is from the bottom, because it's not like there's a bunch of well-funded Latino writers sitting there with shows ready to go and they're just not getting picked. It's systemic. There aren't as many Latino musical theater writers compared to population compared to white writers, and they aren't getting the same amount of dollar per dollar funding. They aren't getting the same amount of development time. And so there's so much of a lack of opportunity in the full structure. and there's no one doing the work. There's no one doing the work specifically for Latine musical theater writers to be able to get more of that time, to be able to get more of a share of the development opportunities, to be able to champion their work in a really important way. And another reason why it's so important to have that like third party for Latine writers is because the work that gets written is not always in English or is bilingual, has Spanish in it, and that's something that until very recently was a big red flag for a producer of like, oh, we can't do this. Like people aren't going to understand, and the music and the cultural stories, it confuses white producers, frankly. They don't know what to do with it. Even excited about the work, they're worried that the work is not going to translate to a white audience, a white theatrical audience. They're not sure that Latino community members are going to come and check out the show. And so, because of that, like when you're already in this competitive sphere, those couple of what seem like small barriers become like mountains because they can look at a white show written by a white writer and they don't have to work those pieces, those things that will get in the way. And it just makes it so it's harder and harder and harder for Latine writers, especially because Latine stories don't always feel like American stories, even though they so are. There's so much about immigration. There's so much about, being indigenous to this country and this continent. There's so much about family. There's so much about culture. Um, and it all really has a place, but those barriers, those things really get in the way when Latino writers are trying to sell their stories to producers. And so what our lab really aims to do is to provide that development space and time to try to even the score, so to speak, so that our writers have the ability to come in and get their words read, have the ability to get feedback, have the ability to get time on their feet with the material instead of having to do everything. As a musical theater performer, like how much gets developed in the room, you know, how much happens when we're on our feet and we're singing together, we're performing together. Music theater is such a collaborative art form in the way that you can sit on your own in your room and write a great play. You can sit on your own in your room and write a great screenplay, and it can be mostly there, and you can take it to a studio and get something produced. Musical theater needs that like living and breathing time, and that's what makes it expensive and magical. And so that's a big part of one of our goals. And you asked me about like where I see us going. I want us to eventually get to a place where we actually have the financial capital and the support to be able to produce work in house, so that we can produce the next Hamilton, the next Dear Evan Hansen, the next off Broadway show that gets picked up, taken to Broadway, wins the Tony, and creates like meaningful representation and financial and commercial success for our writers. And also, just so the people listening don't think I'm totally Broadway centric, uh, we also just want to be able to like take shows that are like really cool and send them to theaters around the country, or work with Latino cultural centers around the country and bring them a show that they can do with their community and they can show you their community or music they can bring in. So it's not just the commercial side; it's also just creating more opportunities for Latino musical theater or things that feel something akin to musical theater have a chance to be seen by audiences around the country. So it's kind of all of that.
There's so much there. That is amazing. That is like amazing.
Sorry, I went on a
No,
monologue.
I love that. That sparked so many more questions that I have too. And I'm one of the biggest ones I think it struck me with is you mentioning that, it's systemic. And do you have thoughts about the fact of like trying to get more exposure to theater at a younger age into like the Latina community, into like young kids in schools? Because I know that's been something talked about just in general, is like we need more of the arts brought into schools to get people started younger.
Yeah, and that's such a big question, and I could build an entire organization that just tries to solve that problem. Is because there's the aspect of what are we doing at regional theaters to make theater more affordable to non-white audiences? How are they changing? How are we helping them with their research, their reach out strategies? Are they providing any programming in Spanish? Are they partnering with any local Spanish cultural centers or Spanish theaters to help provide programming that's in Spanish? People are bilingual, but there's a difference between being bilingual and maybe being able to have a conversation and being bilingual and being able to watch a show entirely in English. There is like how are we reaching out? How are we bringing theater to kids at that age? And I think it's on the I hate to say it's on the fringes of what we do, because I am really passionate about like being able to be like a national resource for Latino cultural centers, Latina cultural centers, and being able to help them with their programming and help them even like know how to produce a musical. I was just on the phone with Crearte Latino in Sarasota, who I got connected with because I was doing a job in Sarasota. And the artistic director there was saying, she wants really badly to put on a musical. She doesn't even know how. They've done concerts, they've done plays, they've done all sorts of programming, but she's not really sure what goes into putting on a musical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there is a lot we can do as an organization with the focus being on how do we get more Latino musical theater produced. There's almost a byproduct or a secondary aspect of that that is great. Then how do we also get these shows seen by the people that they're for, not just the white audiences that are already frequent theaters? And then how do we also leverage that so that those people come back and maybe see a show that isn't specifically for them, but that is still going to be meaningful and awesome and enrich their lives through art. And I think a lot of theaters forget that our work can actually help with that outreach into the community so that they're diversifying their audiences by bringing them work that probably isn't for their white, subscribers, but it's still like, music theater is universal enough that you don't think of how many stories you've seen that aren't for you but touch you.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's so important. And it's so important, I think, just to like expose people to other things and find that, like, force them to find that universality of it. So, one of the topics we've talked about all semester, and I think we kind of opened with it one of the first weeks of class, was what does it mean for theater to be Latinx or Latina? Like, what constitutes that? And you had brought up earlier, like, West Side Story, and we had a whole long debate on the week that we did, like, musical theater about, like, is it actually Latina, seeing as it was like written by white men. So I'm just curious
Mm-hmm.
your thoughts on that. And I even read some articles in researching for this that like there are a ton of people who consider Hamilton to be a breakthrough because it like features Latina performers, but it's not necessarily like a Latina story. So I'm just curious your thoughts on
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're like how you set that up is like starting to encapsulate some of the nuance of it. Um, because every single like major work of art we have is problematic,
that. Mm-hmm.
and we can sit and have an hour long conversation of just to start to break the surface of like why West Side Story is problematic, why In the Heights is problematic, and why Hamilton is problematic. um, on Your Feet is pretty bubble, and I don't know that anybody has terribly any problems with it, but it's On Your Feet. It's so happy that that story is being told, but you know what I mean. But it's like for that show to exist, it was like, well, Gloria Estefan had to like be part of the show and like herald that show to Broadway. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, so the only way we could get like a more authentic like Latina story that feels a bit more like us on stage was because this one famous person who managed to cross over herself was able to like shepherd it, right? And like there's nothing wrong about that except for the fact that there's no it's not also not happening in like the normal pipeline. So like that's my issue, not with actually On Your Feet or that show or anything involved with that. um but all of these shows like highlight different problematic things about how Latina people are displayed in art, are displayed in musical theater. Like the one real Latina show, like besides On Your Feet, is In the Heights, which is like about it displays certain stereotypes that I think are really comfortable for a white audience
Mm-hmm.
to view. And look, I love the movie despite its shortcomings as well too. And it
Yeah.
was so exciting, and I'm sure I'm gonna love West Side Story in its own way as well too. But like, I think anybody who thinks deeply enough about it has really complicated relationships to every single one of these shows.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Avita, all of them have uh, all of them have complicated relationships to Latinidad. And so it is hard to say like, are any of these shows really Latina shows? And there's still Latina shows being produced and workshopped around that have been written by white people. Um, and I'm already seeing, like, only having been in this sphere of like the producer's mind on this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm already seeing that, like, what a difference there is when a story is really thought through by the people who it's for versus all the things that get missed and have to like be fixed
Mm-hmm.
when some or all of the whiters are right, or are white rather. They aren't right; they're white. Um,
Yeah.
so, like, what constitutes your original question? What constitutes a Latinx show? I think all of our canon is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that means that it should never be done again, per se. And we don't need another West Side Story revival ever again, as far as I'm concerned. Um, and I think all of the other shows have their place.
Mm-hmm.
And the bigger thing for me is like just keeping the dialogue like aware. Like, I'm gonna go see West Side Story with my mom, and like it's gonna be wonderful. And at the same time, I have a really complicated relationship to it. Its portrayal of Latin folks, the fact that it was written by a bunch of white men, and the fact that we keep producing it instead of something new.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those things get to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so complex.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be, but it is. Yeah, and I think this had made me curious earlier too, with something you had said just about how like Lin Manuel Miranda obviously took off and blew up, and I don't know if sometimes the world and industry can get fixated on like, oh well, he made it so great, cool, you like it's great, we have something, there you go. And so I don't know if some of that has been almost like a detriment to the growth, just because
Hmm.
they see that and go, oh yeah, awesome, cool, you got your one. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't say it goes as far as say it's a detriment, because regardless of who it was, this is like going to be the natural reaction as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we get one breakthrough artist, and this happens for any minority group. It's like, oh well, there was one, deaf production of Spring Awakening in a couple of years. Like, they've gotten there. That our quota has been met for being, open and accepting of people with disabilities on Broadway. Yay!
Yeah.
Um, and I do think because Lynn's star shines so brightly, um, there are ways in which that's really, really beneficial. And there are ways, if you actually like sit down and you think about, like, oh yeah, like, one person might be like, yeah, there's plenty of, Latina representation on Broadway. And then I could sit there and be like, okay, well, how many Latina writers have been on Broadway? How many Latina musical theater writers have been on Broadway? The answer is two. Three, if you want to count, Gloria Stefan and as like a music writer, but they didn't compose a show. They took their own music and helped arrange it. So I don't know that I count that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, not discounting the show. On Your Feet's great, but there have been two earnest musical theater writers on Broadway. That's it. So it doesn't matter if he's had two really wildly successful shows.
Mm-hmm.
It just kind of furthers the idea, like, you have to be friggin' excellent to break the barrier, because there's been plenty of mediocre white writers on Broadway, lots and lots and lots of them. We get them every year.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of weird to say, but like, I'll know that we don't have a problem when mediocre Latina writers are allowed to be on Broadway, and they're allowed to fail, and it doesn't like admonish all Latina writers forever, and now nobody wants to produce their work because one Latina writer had a mediocre show, because
Mm-hmm.
that's happened in white people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I am curious at this point where you see the Latin or Latina influence on theater heading, and what you feel
Hmm.
needs to be done. I know we've kind of touched on that a little bit,
Yeah.
but yeah, just what you feel like needs to be done in order for more Latina musicals and writers and composers to be represented and make it all the way to
Hmm.
main
Hmm.
stages.
Yeah, for yourself and your classmates and anyone who might be watching this, I would go look up the APAC diversity reports from New York. They released the 2018, I believe it's the 2018, 2019, and I've referenced it a little earlier.
Mm-hmm.
They released that last summer, and I'm not sure if they'll do a report this year because, COVID, there's not much to report on. But they released it for about 4 years. And you can see, I would say there's three really huge factors. Number one is the lack of funding um, non-white that BIPOC theaters get compared to primarily white institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's the numbers are astounding how underfunded um, Black, Indigenous, people of color theaters are in New York City. Massive differences. So as long as the primarily white institutions are able to thrive while the BIPOC theaters can't, I think there's a figure in there that said half of the artistic directors at those theaters didn't even take a salary. How can you create? How can you lead when either you have to come from privilege so that you don't need to take the salary, or you have to work an extra job or two,
Mm-hmm.
or do a bunch of other things that you can't give your full artistic focus to the theater. And this is not admonishing any of those people. It's actually just to say like they're being scrappy as hell and they're doing what they can to get the art going and to
Mm-hmm.
get the stuff produced. But they have the fact that they have to be that scrappy just to exist in the New York theater space is insane. So that's part one. Like the theaters who are doing the work need funding, need to be overfunded, not underfunded, compared to their these primarily white institutions that have had plenty of funding for years and years and years and years. So
Mm-hmm.
that's piece one. Piece two is we look at these primarily white institutions and then we look at their artistic directors and their artistic staff. And it's the artistic directors, it's almost entirely white. And when I say almost entirely white, I mean, I think the numbers are above 90% white.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, quite frequently male, as I'm sure you're not surprised to find that out either. Um,
Yeah.
and so that really trickles down. I'm actually in the middle of a research project. I'm looking at the Latina representation both on artistic staffs and on boards. And I can't tell you how often I look and I'm like, oh, look, there's the one,
Mm-hmm.
especially on the boards. Go look at, go if you, this is all Googleable because any not for profit theater is required to have their financial statements, is required to list their boards and their staff online. So you can go to Lincoln Center's website, you can go to Second Stage's website in New York and go look at their boards. And when those boards are, one of 40 people is Latino or Latina, and another five are other, it's almost like they like got to catch them all. Cool, we got one person of this group. Yay, we're diverse. And it's hard because and this is kind of me transitioning to my third thing. There aren't enough board members of underrepresented groups, and there certainly aren't enough board members of Latina folks compared to our population spread. I think the number said something like 3%. I might be making that up. Double check the AAPAC report, but I want to say it's something like 3 to 5% of boards are Latina.
Mm-hmm.
What 27% of New York City is Latina, and so the boards have a lot of power. They do a lot of work, and if they're primarily white, it's even harder to break down the barriers. Like I was saying earlier, like if we constantly are having to translate everything to all the white people around us
Mm-hmm.
of like what our culture is, what our art is, we don't have the shorthand. We don't benefit from the shorthand of if I'm telling a white story and I just talk to you about like a brunch or like mama's cooking. Like I could bring you a southern story, a story that's like very culturally American, and you already have the shorthand to understand all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I bring to you a Latina story, and I have to explain every single piece. And there's nobody else who's like, oh yeah, this speaks to me. Hey, this is why this is really important. This is why this is going to translate. You have to take me on trust, and it just widens the barrier to for someone to take a chance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so having that small amount of board members in New York, even right, and that's reflective of the country as a whole, that are Latina,
Mm-hmm.
really affects the way the ship gets steered. So the ship is not getting like a lot of the stuff from the top is just not getting steered. The funding, the staff, and the boards.
Yeah. Once again, systemic. And
Yeah.
yeah. I'm curious if, I don't know, if there's more or like push, and I don't want to say specifically for musical theater because New York City is more like the musical theater hub of America. But I'm just
Yeah.
curious because we've also been focusing on like Latina theater as a whole, not just musicals. And so I feel like there have been a decent amount of theaters out here in LA that we've studied, especially like when we were studying Chicano theater and or Chicanx theater, that like there's pushes out here, but I'm just curious like the difference with it like LA versus New York just because of like population
Mm.
size and if maybe that has been on like people's minds of like oh well we don't think that there's like a big enough population here even though that's false but I don't know
Mm.
if like geography plays a role into that too. I'm curious.
Yeah, I'll be honest and say I'm not sure about the answer to that. I wouldn't be surprised if simply because the Latina population in LA is much larger.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I do think that I'm gonna make this assumption, and I could be incorrect. Something that we struggle with, like not to keep bringing this back to musical theater, but just because that's my expertise. Something that can be a really big struggle is that when it comes to musical theater, it's more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
More development time is needed. More money has to go into each individual production, and so theaters might are taking a bigger risk on what they program musically, um, and so it can make people very conservative in how they approach the financial model of it. And so I think when you do look at LA theater, it is a there's a lot less money, and things are not nearly as risky.
Mm-hmm.
And then that also goes for the same when it comes to plays. And so there are organizations doing a lot of great work to influence what kinds of plays get produced, and to the Soul Project. There's Latinx Playwrights Circle, and they're doing a lot of great work as well as a lot of other organizations to help get more plays out there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also more inexpensive to do that. It's also a lot less expensive for a theater that does both plays and musicals to program, a great new Latinx play and then do Annie or Sound of Music or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit of a barrier that I think we run into with musicals. And then I also would imagine would be something between New York and LA where putting a show on Broadway is a much huger capital investment and a much huger risk, much larger risk.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas doing like the programming at a theater in LA, where my understanding is the budgets are much lower, there's a little bit scrappier of a theater community, looks a lot different. So comparing two landscapes is great because that's one place we start. We get traction at smaller theaters, we get traction in smaller ways, we get traction in plays, we get traction in indie films, wherever. Um, but there's definitely barriers as you get higher up in the totem pole of like what kind of financial capital we're talking about someone investing in our stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. I've reached the end of my, I think, biggest questions related to Latinx Latina musical theater. So I just want to say thank you again for meeting with me, sharing a bit about you and your experience. Are there any last, I don't know, things on the topic that didn't get discussed that you feel need to?
No, I think just a little bit about us that I didn't say. We're based in New York City. We've got a physical home in New York, and we've got a space there that we bring actors into, we bring writers into, and we work through all that. We have education programs that we run. But despite the fact that we're physically based in New York, we're very much a national organization. We offer our programming, a lot of our programming, also virtually. One of our co-artistic directors is based in Florida. Like it's really important to us that we're creating this national family, this national community. And so, I'd really encourage you or whoever's watching, like if this is something that you're really excited about or something you want to keep an eye on, something you want to be involved with, find us at our website, join our emailing list. That's the best way to stay connected with what's going on. And we also share a lot of news about Latino theater. So through our emails. So if this is like something you're really passionate about or you're really interested in staying on top of and being involved with, whether that's now or in the future, I'd recommend going to our website, www.latinemtlab, LATINEMT lab.org, and you can sign up for our list there. You can keep up to date with what we're doing as we develop. We're a very new organization. We just started this year, and so we're excited to see where it's going to grow. And we'd love to have you and any of your classmates, anyone who's watching, with us on the journey. Because we're stronger when we build that community. And I think that's what people are really starting to learn. You know, Latinx people, AAPI people, and ASA. Like, if you notice over the past several years, there's been a lot of coming together of these different groups in recognition of our differences, not doing what someone else might do or an outside group might say, oh yeah, all Latino, all Hispanic people are the same. No, we're coming together as a Latino community with the acknowledgement that we all carry different relationships to our Latinidad. We carry different experiences from where we're from, what country our parents are from, what country we're from, and that's a beautiful thing that we can come together not in spite of our differences, but like with our differences, like worn on our sleeve and love each other for them. And so that sounds like a little hippy dippy, but I think that's what a lot of groups are doing because they're realizing like we don't have to all pretend like we're the exact same to come together for the benefit of everyone. Because like if one person is successful, it helps carry the whole ship when we're together. You know, so
Yeah,
anyway,
absolutely. No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I will stop the
you're
recording
welcome.
now to end that part of it. Yeah.